Now on to a Late Show special, in search of the elusive Mr. Greene.
I've been very lucky in my relations, which have always lasted a long period of time and left great friendship behind them. So I don't have any fear of loneliness. In fact, when I married, my fear was not being sufficiently alone. And that has also been a constant thing with me. I feel that I have to be alone for my work, and it's a lonely work, writing, except for the theatre. And one has to be alone, and one has to appreciate loneliness. And I find it very easy to be alone, and that's why, to some extent, I travel a good deal. To be away from friends, be away even from people I love. So loneliness has never been a problem for me.
Good evening. Graham Greene died today in Geneva at the age of 86. Tonight's Late Show is devoted to the man and his career. Anthony Burgess will be giving an assessment of his fellow novelist and South of France exile. We'll be showing more of that interview with which we began the programme, the only time Greene ever spoke freely about himself on camera. We'll be talking to the programme makers who did their best to coax him onto screen, including Christopher Burstall, who produced the omnibus film, which was shown on bbc2 earlier this evening. And our guests in the studio will be remembering the man and assessing the novels and entertainments of a writer who's still probably best known as the creator of Harry Lime and the seedy post-war Vienna of The Third Man, captured in Carol Reed's classic film. Graham Greene's great subject was failure, and his great fear was boredom.
What kind of a spy do you think you are, Satchelfoot? What are you tailing me for? Cat got your tongue? Come on out. Come out, whoever you are. Step out in the light and let's have a look at it. Who's your boss?
It was the fear of boredom that made him such an enthusiastic traveller. Deported out of Puerto Rico or flying into Kenya in the middle of the Mau Mau rebellion, he was always, as his second volume of autobiography put it, looking for ways of escape. And no way quicker than the experiment he tried in the autumn of 1923, when still at school in Berkhamsted, just outside London.
Unhappy love, I suppose, has sometimes driven boys to suicide, but this was not suicide, whatever a coroner's jury might have said. It was a gamble, with 5 chances to 1 against an inquest. The discovery that it was possible to enjoy again the visible world by risking its total loss was one I was bound to make sooner or later. I put the muzzle of the revolver into my right ear and pulled the trigger. There was a minute click, and looking down at the chamber, I could see that the charge had moved into the firing position. I was out by 1. I remember an extraordinary sense of jubilation, as if carnival lights had been switched on in a dark, drab street. My heart knocked in its cage, and life contained an infinite number of possibilities. It was like a young man's first successful experience of sex, as if among the Ashridge beaches I had passed the test of manhood. I went home and put the revolver back in the corner cupboard.
The unsuccessful suicide went on to write 3 highly promising novels before winning the public's attention with that classic travel thriller, Stamboul Train. That book he classified as an entertainment, and one of Greene's greatest achievements is his ability to remind us that the novel has a duty to tell a story.
Give me the gun! What? Good, Daddy, you're just in time. You get the bogey and I'll do the girl. I told you not to touch that girl, didn't I? Daddy! Come on, take him if you're going to take him. Just what?
Rock is a thriller set in a seaside town in which we meet Pinky, a boy gangster who is a Catholic dedicated to evil and damnation. What makes the book remarkable is its passionate concern with the question of faith. Greene was converted to Catholicism while at Oxford, but his belief always had the keen edge of those for whom religion is a matter of intellectual risk. The great books of his maturity excite us because at their centre are questions of more import than who murdered whom or why. As he said of his novel The Heart of the Matter, the tale of a police officer in a fly-blown West African colony during the war, I mean the story of Scobie to enlarge a theme which I'd touched on before, the disastrous effect on human beings of pity as distinct from compassion.
He had always been prepared to accept the responsibility for his actions, and he had always been half aware, too, from the time he made his terrible private vow that she should be happy, how far this action might carry him. Despair is the price one pays for setting oneself an impossible aim. It is, one is told, the unforgivable sin, but it is a sin the corrupt or evil man never practices. He always has hope. He never reaches the freezing point of knowing absolute failure. Only the man of good will carries always in his heart this capacity for damnation.
Greene once said in his later years that the man he most wanted to see was Kim Philby, with a bottle of wine on the table between them. And while he was only a short-lived communist, he was a lifelong opponent of the cruelty and intolerance of those in power, whether in Moscow, Paraguay, or Haiti.
What the hell is this? Who are these thugs?
I am Captain Concasseur, and these thugs are the President's Special Police, Tonton Marcoute. They have received very unfair publicity in your British journals.
They'll have worse after this. I demand to see my ambassador.
You have no ambassador, Major Jones. We expelled him 3 months ago. This is Michel. I always have him present at interrogations.
But it is not as a rebellious Catholic he took the baptismal name of Thomas after doubting Thomas, not Thomas Aquinas, or near-communist, that Graham Greene will be remembered. He was, as brilliant late novels like Monsignor Quixote or The Captain and the Enemy remind us, one of the finest storytellers of the century. No one could pace a tale quite like Greene. Who can forget the sudden, heart-stopping realization that the central character of the human factor is a double agent? Or Wilson's first view of Scobie from the balcony of his hotel. There is, too, the brilliant touch with place, whether the Clapham of The End of the Affair or the Vietnam of The Quiet American, and that enduring, relentlessly clear prose.
Excitement is simple. Excitement is a situation, a single event. It mustn't be wrapped up in thoughts, similes, metaphors. Discrimination for one's words is certainly required, but not love of one's words. That is a form of self-love.
Greene may have been the most celebrated British novelist of his generation, but he resisted with a passion any attempts to turn him into a media celebrity. Requests for television interviews were almost invariably met with a polite refusal. To be seen on camera, he felt, would change him from a writer into a performer. But with some ingenuity, programme makers occasionally found ways to work closely with Greene without committing the cardinal sin of allowing his face to appear. The Late Show spoke to two of them.
East Germany, Sierra Leone, Cuba, Jamaica, India, liquor permit, Dahomey, the whole mass of smudgy entry permits, Vietnam. The Hunted Man is the main obsession of my books.
We shot the film with Greene in the late 60s, and what we were trying to do was make a documentary about his work and about the way in which he figured in his work, really. He was in Paris at the time, and so we met just before midnight at the Gare de Lyon, with through tickets for Turkey, via Switzerland, Italy, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Greece. A working trip, not a travelogue, to Istanbul for 3 days and 2 nights. It became a trip across Europe. We took the Orient Express together, partly because he'd written Istanbul Train a good while ago, and principally because when we'd met to talk about making a film, we'd had a very engaging time together, very entertaining man, very serious man, with great fun. But he wouldn't budge about appearing, and he said that he didn't want to show his face in the film, but he'd be happy to collaborate and cooperate in any way apart from appearing.
Why did you decide not to be filmed? I'd be afraid of playing a part on the screen. Playing part of who? I'm not quite sure. Playing part of a writer, part of a Catholic, I don't know. But I think I would be a little bit of a part, you know. And I would cease to be a writer and I would become a comedian. I feel myself infinitely corruptible. It's just possible that it might be successful. And then I'll be tempted to do it again. Like a successful first night with a woman, I would want to repeat it.
Greene had written an essay called The Other Graham Greene, which appeared as almost as a postscript in his own rather cryptic biography. And it purported to describe the carryings-on of somebody who masqueraded as Graham Greene. Greene had read newspaper reports, he'd had telephone conversations, he'd had sightings of somebody who was claiming to be himself. And Greene used this mysterious character as a means, I suppose, to meditate upon the nature of identity, and that's what the essay was about.
For many years I found myself in search of someone who called himself Graham Greene. Photographs in a Geneva newspaper and a Jamaican one. Once a telephone call from a woman in Rome. Even letters from strangers who remember me at a wedding I never attended, or serving a mass I never served. The other calls himself Graham Greene. Perhaps his name is Graham Greene. There's no copyrighted name.
I started by thumbing through the telephone directories and finding everybody else called Graham Greene. But we then took it a bit further, obviously approached Greene himself and put the idea to him. And it amused and entertained him. He was, it fitted in with his own desire for secrecy.
Well, I'm Graham Greene, I'm a plumber, starting my own business. Fortunately, it's quite successful. I've lived in Basildon most of my life. And I'm quite happy where I am.
Graham, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
I'm Graham Greene. I live in Whitstable, Kent, and I'm an electrical technician. I'm 44 years old.
I received a summons one day to meet him the next day for coffee at the Ritz in London. And I'd never met him before, and turned up at the appointed time. There was no Mr. Greene staying at the Ritz, and I mentioned my name, and he'd left a message for me, and I was sent up to the top floor to meet someone, I can't remember his name now, someone staying there under a pseudonym. And I got to the top floor, and the entire corridor of the hotel of the Ritz was stretched ahead of me, and at the far end of it was Graham Greene. So he had the duration of the corridor to size me up. And I got there, and he said, "Good morning, Mr. Finch," in his instantly recognisable, gravelly voice. "Good morning, Mr. Finch." He says, "I don't like the way this film's going. You're getting too close to me. I think we'll have to put an end to it."
I think your idea is a very amusing one, especially if it does not entail my appearing on the screen, which I would have had to refuse. I'm perfectly happy to help in any way I can if I'm around. Yours sincerely, Graham Greene.
I tried to get Greene to show his face in the film more than once, even after we'd embarked on the show, even after we'd taken the train from Paris to Istanbul, because I thought the audience would feel cheated, would miss him, as I was missing him a bit, sometimes more than a bit, in prospect. But he wouldn't budge on that, and although I tried several times, I had to settle, in the end, not unwillingly, for his free talk about anything that I chose to raise.
later, for me, there was the pleasure of opium. One's troubles, one's worries, one's anxieties seemed to go far away to the horizon. One thought one was seeing them in proportion to the whole of one's life. One could discover them. It was a very sociable thing to do. One smoked in pairs, exchanging a pipe from hand to hand. And one talked a great deal.
I thought he gave me entirely bogus reasons for not wanting to show himself in the film. What he said was that he thought that he'd like becoming a sort of telly figure, that the temptation would be great, and that he'd spend too much time doing it. I think that was all nonsense. I think really he, like most of us, enjoyed a private life, and he wanted to keep things that way.
I think he saw himself as much a journalist as an author. He saw his trips as being journalistic recce's, and anything that removed his privacy, that moved him from being a private person to becoming a public person, that stopped him engaging in a personal way with strangers, that got in the way of that. Anything like that, he was not prepared to see happen. I did ask him, I said to him, I don't understand why you're not prepared to appear on film, yet you're prepared to be interviewed and you're prepared to be photographed. And he said, well, a photograph's different. A photograph doesn't mean the same thing. I'm not sure that I quite agree with him. I think a photo is to me as much of an icon, and people in that Graham Greene image has come down to us through photos. I mean, this is the best that he would allow us, which was a photo I took of him on his balcony in the south of France, and this is a substitute for the real thing at one point in the film.
I was once at a party, and I was sort of marched into the room and introduced as Graham Greene, and a young lady managed to corner me in the kitchen and began to tell me exactly why she didn't like Graham Greene's books, his drab prose style, the depth of his characters. Found meeting someone at a party called Graham Greene gave her this ideal chance in which to sort of let off some of her steam.
I was always worried he would appear, because it would have completely screwed up the whole premise of the film. At the same time, of course, I couldn't resist asking him whether he would, and he, as a gentleman, said no. But I suppose every filmmaker must hold out the hope that the big fish will one day say, okay, I'll sit down and I'll talk. There are very few of them left, of course, now.
Never a hunted tiger, I don't think, perhaps a hunted rabbit.
He claimed later that we saw his hands. We didn't. They were my hands.
Does Graham Greene appear in my film? I wish I could answer that straightforwardly. Perhaps he appears in some shots. Perhaps he doesn't. The reason I'm being difficult is because he makes claims that certain parts of his anatomy appeared, but like his hands, like his shadow, but they could belong to anybody. I mean, who knows? There is one clip of him on the end of a long telephoto lens, which I'm told is Graham Greene. It certainly looked rather like him. It was shot in the south of France. I didn't take it, so I can't promise you that it's him.
There was just one occasion on which Greene allowed himself to talk freely and personally on camera. It was in the mid-80s. Greene had become deeply involved in a political row in the south of France concerning a local politician whom Greene accused of corruption. So strong were his feelings that he broke the habit of a lifetime and invited in a Bavarian TV crew. In the course of the interview, however, the topic strayed some way from local politics.
Why do you so often use in your personal remarks the word escape? What are you escaping from?
Boredom. One thing. Well, that's one of the
very clear from your work.
And that even when I was young, even when I was 16, I used to suffer the affliction of boredom.
And what does it to you, boredom? Isn't boredom sometimes also relaxing?
No.
Not to you?
No.
I like to be bored once in a while.
Oh, well, then you're not a melancholic. I think boredom and melancholy have to go together.
Oh, I see.
A little bit.
And it kills creativity.
Boredom. Yes, except that perhaps if boredom drives one to creativity, to escape again. To escape into imaginary characters.
But you're an extremely disciplined thinker and writer. I mean, from your books, you can only be quiet in admiration of a man who holds a story together so well, which needs lots of discipline, which is not the sign of a melancholy.
And also a lot of practice. After all, one's been doing it for 50 years.
Admit it, but a melancholic is not in a position of being so strong and disciplined. Do you really think you are a melancholic? I don't think so.
I think a manic depressive, more than a melancholic. When one has one's manic periods.
I only saw your manic phases then.
But today, well, one has been on one's manic side. Inspired by the remarks of Daniel Gee.
And where does your belief come in? I mean, is it a weapon against depression?
A belief in what?
Belief in God.
Well, as I say, belief gets weaker and weaker as I approach death. It becomes weaker and weaker, but I still have, it's still sufficient for a Catholic to say, well, you're wrong.
Why does your belief get weaker and weaker?
Is it a question of vitality?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's, one goes back, perhaps it's a return to second childhood, because as a boy I had no belief at all. As a young man. My belief, I think, I wouldn't say comes back, but my wavering belief gets a little firmer in the company of certain people. Of certain people whose goodness seems to me to be almost must have some kind of supernatural origin.
But on the whole, you would say the older you get and the nearer you get to death, your belief gets weaker.
Partly perhaps because I'm less interested. I mean, when I was young, I was interested in death, even to the extent of playing Russian roulette, which was an interest in death.
But don't you think there must be a conclusive reason for a belief getting weaker with age? What's the reason?
Well, it's also because I was convinced intellectually that Christianity was likely to be true. And I was convinced intellectually that among Christian bodies, the Catholic Church was probably nearest to the truth and had a profounder view. And all these arguments which one listened to, I'd forgotten.
Graham Greene in 1983. Another eminent British novelist who has made his home in the south of France is Anthony Burgess. I spoke to him on the phone earlier this evening. Anthony Burgess, what was Greene like as a private man?
I first met him when I'd come back from Malaya. I was bringing some silk shirts back for him from Kuala Lumpur, and we had lunch together, and we talked together. But he'd read my first book, which was called Time for a Tiger, about Malaya, but regarded me as a kind of vaguely amusing, fairly light, entertaining character, and he had no doubt that he himself was the one man qualified to deal with the perturbations of white men's souls in the East and that kind of thing. He was a little too conscious of his own ability, I said at the time, but he was a nice man, fundamentally, very pleasant.
Do you think his stories live? Do they make sense across the world, or are they local tales?
Well, his stories do not make all that much sense in the areas where the stories themselves are set. I remember teaching in Malaysia his novel, The Heart of the Matter, and this was regarded as a great joke because it's about a man who commits suicide because he's in love with two women. You know, the general response of the Muslims was, why the hell didn't he marry both of them and marry another two while he was at it? Why all this big Catholic nonsense about sin and throwing himself away from the sight of God and so on. I think his appeal has been decidedly a European appeal, and I think more specifically even a very British appeal. He's a very British writer in some ways.
You're both Catholic writers. Do you think you're very different kinds of Catholic writers? What kind of a Catholic was Greene?
I think the main difference between us, Nigel, was this, that he was a convert, and I was, and still am, a cradle Catholic. And there's a tremendous gap between the two. It's something that Evelyn Waugh was always aware of. He himself was a convert. But Evelyn Waugh became very, very rigid, very, indeed, very sanctimonious in some ways. Greene had no real feeling for the church, but he was extremely interested in the theology, which he knew how to exploit in fiction. He was interested in little points of canon law, for example. The question arises, is it ever lawful to commit the sin of coitus interruptus in the sexual act? And the answer is yes, if somebody knocks and then comes into the room.
His heroes are often tormented by guilt, racked by guilt and agony, especially over sexual questions. Was that Greene's character? He seems in his few public appearances to have been a very calm, statesman-like figure.
He understood the nature of guilt. I don't think he was much troubled by it himself. Again, it was a useful bit of material for fiction. But when they talk about Greenland, this special territory he was supposed to have chartered, the journalistic view is that it's about places where white men go to pieces under the palm trees and drink themselves to death and visit native brothels occasionally and are tortured by various kinds of remorse. I put that to him once, and he said, the real Greenland is just a world in which people are conscious of original sin and don't seem to have much hope of redemption. Of course, this is very un-Catholic. You don't find much of the Christ figure in his work, but you do get a lot of sin. The sense of being thrown out of the Garden of Eden and not able to get back again.
He was also, you once said that no one's liver lasts forever except possibly Graham Greene's. He had prodigious appetites for life, alcohol, drugs.
Well, he did. He and I were both opium takers at different periods. It was rumoured that when I'd brought home his silk shirts from Kuala Lumpur, there were opium pellets sewn into the cuffs, but I don't think that was really true. However, he had taken opium, and I myself had taken it. We both believed in opium. That was one thing that brought us together. And, he was, I wouldn't say he was a prodigious drinker. He wasn't a drinker on the Irish pattern, like Brendan Behan. But he did have an incredible capacity for various kinds of whiskey and for very, very dry martinis. He boasted that his liver was totally impervious to decay because he'd started drinking very, very young. When he was taking his degree, his viva voce, he had to be held up by two students, one on either side. But I don't think it was all that great. He loved life in a sense, but life to him, I think, meant really travel, going to exotic places. And this he put down, I think, one of his books as a kind of escape from himself. I don't think he quite knew who he was. And by changing the scenery all the time, he didn't really have to ask that question, who am I?
What's your final estimation of his stature as a writer? Is he a great writer, do you think?
Well, I don't, unfortunately, one should not say this now. One should not say anything bad of the dead. But I think the time will come in a few months, or possibly a year, when people will begin to consider his stature as a writer. I don't think it's very high myself. I don't think it's as high as that of, say, Evelyn Waugh, friend and contemporary, or say, Anthony Powell. I think that he is liked as a writer because he does purvey a special bit of flavor of his own, this mixture of the kind of adventure story and Catholic theology. But the thing about it now, he was fond of Conrad, he was fond of Ford Madox Ford, and he thought of himself as a kind of successor to Conrad. But he knew and admitted to me that he wasn't as great, that he had, in a sense, opted out of the possibility of greatness. He was writing novels that would sell. Some of them of very great brevity. He never gave himself a chance to expand in the depiction of character or indeed even in the development of his ideas. He ends up as a very good minor writer, but his stature is far, far less than that of Conrad or of Ford Madox Ford.
Anthony Burgess, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Nigel.
Anthony Burgess speaking earlier this evening. Joining me now are novelist Piers Paul Reed, novelist and publisher Robert McCrum, and the biographer and translator Michael Meyer. Piers Paul Reed, some harsh words there from Anthony Burgess on Greene's reputation. Justified, do you think?
No, I think he's hard on him. I can't think who is better than Graham Greene of his generation. I think he did a great service to the novel by making the narrative novel and the adventure novel respectable in literary circles at a time when the sort of nouveau roman was rather disintegrating the modern novel. He obviously isn't one of the greatest world geniuses. I think his weakness is his women. I think his female characters are rather weak. I think that went in a way with his attitude towards sex, which was rather adolescent. But I think he was a much better writer than Burgess.
Robert McCrum, do you concur with Mr. Burgess?
No, I don't, not for a minute. I also think that, in a way, we should leave it to the next generation to evaluate Greene finally. But for me, growing up reading him, he is somebody who is part of my subconscious, literary subconscious. And I feel today, as I felt 2 or 3 years ago when Samuel Beckett died, that somehow a great figure has passed from the scene. How he'll finally be evaluated is not for us to say, but clearly he is somebody who showed by his example as a writer a tremendous dedication to his work, a tremendous clarity of vision and eye, a great strength of purpose, and a great capacity to renew his writing decade by decade. He wrote several very fine books rather than one or two, and I think that's a tremendous inspiration actually to writers today.
Michael Meyer, you actually knew him, well indeed Piers Paul Reed knew him as well. What was Greene the man like? He seems so far from our programme to have been a slightly shadowy, unget-at-able figure.
Well, he was great fun, I thought. I mean, my memories of him are of enormous evenings of hilarity in pubs or wherever. You know, we went round the world together, just the two of us, in 1959-60. He was an awfully easy travelling companion, very mischievous, practical jokes, that kind of thing. He was very manic-depressive, as he said in that clip we saw where he spoke about himself, and much more much more depressive and indeed suicidal in the early days. I first met him in 1944, and I remember in about 1950 asking Edward Sackville West, the writer who knew him well, what do you think Graham will be writing in 10 years? And Eddie said, oh, he'll have committed suicide in 10 years. And I remember thinking and saying, yes, he will. But then he mellowed greatly, and the graph evened out very considerably in later years.
Piers Paul Reed, you also knew him through your family.
Yes, he was a great friend of my father's. He's my sister's godfather and was a very good godfather. He sent her every copy of his book she got, and he was very affectionate in that way. I think he was very shy. He was a very shy man. This mischievous quality was very important. I mean, in a way, there was something about him of a retarded adolescent. I think he loved sort of tricks against authority, things like having the passport that he was given by the president of Panama, which meant that he could go into America, despite the Americans having said he couldn't go into America, and getting his bank statements from his Swiss bank account in disguised handwriting, and lots of little tricks like that he liked very much indeed, and that went with his passion for Secret Service.
But it is an extraordinary life, isn't it? We haven't really touched much on the life so far, and these early attempts at suicide, the attendance at this extraordinary school. McCrum, do you think Graham Greene was a man seriously mentally disturbed from very early on? He was in analysis quite
I think
young.
it must have been very difficult for him. He grew up in his father's school, and there's a phrase I picked out this afternoon looking at the sort of life. He describes himself as being the son of a quisling in an occupied country. So I think from an early age, to take up Piers Paul Reed's point, he was playing games, he was poking fun at authority, he was probably enjoying disguises, finding conspiracies to get round the oppressive power under which he lived, having his father on the other side of the Green Bay's door, headmaster within the school. And I think that must have been something which probably haunted him throughout his life and very much informed the way in which he looked at the world.
He did rather enjoy playing games, didn't he? Michael Myers, he was a member of MI6 during the war, I think, in West Africa.
Yes, that's right. And he got very annoyed when I muddled it up with MI5, for which he had the greatest contempt. I was ticked off for saying that. He was he was very inventive in his practical jokes. There was a terrible game he invented, which was played late at night after drinking, round about midnight or later, where you opened the telephone book at random, each of you, and picked out a name with your eyes shut, and then you had to ring that person, and the game was won by whoever kept the stranger keep talking longest. And he was marvellous at it. He'd keep him talking ages. And once he found another Graham Greene who was a retired solicitor in Golders Green, and he rang him up and said, "Are you Graham Greene?" And the man said, "Well, my name." Then Graham said, "Are you the man who writes these filthy pornographic novels?" The man said, "No, I'm a retired solicitor." And Graham said, "Well, if I'd written these disgusting books, at least I'd have the honesty to admit." And then he would ring him up with different voices, which he was clever at. And in the end, the poor man in Golders Green had to take his name out of the telephone book. He's very naughty in that kind of way.
Yes, he sounds as if he could be a bit of a monster if you happen to have the same name as him. Piers Paul Reed, the Catholicism was touched on briefly by Anthony Burgess there. Do you think that Greene was really a Catholic, or was he someone posing as a Catholic? Was it a form of disguise?
Well, only the Inquisition are qualified to say whether people are Catholics or not. I thought that was very sad, that interview with Bavarian television, when he said that as he got older he believed less. I certainly, when I got to know him later in life, felt that his faith wasn't very strong, and he didn't, as it were, live the Catholic religion in a way that would suggest that it was. He didn't have much love of family life. His sexual morals, as we all know, weren't strictly according to the Church's teaching. And one really did feel, and I think he felt, cut off from the grace of God, in a sense. And I think that is very sad.
Sexuality, obviously, is a problem at the heart, for his hero, at the heart of a lot of the books. Another area he tackles constantly, especially in the later books, is communism, a belief that tempted him very briefly in the early part of his life. How serious a communist do you think he was? Robert McCrum.
Well, I think I can answer this rather personally, because I was in Cuba recently, and as you know, he was a lifelong friend of Castro, and there are many very dedicated, still, Cuban communists who, when you go there and you go in the bars and you meet them, writers mainly, speak very highly of and warmly of his many visits there. And it's clear that although, as the programme said, he enjoyed travel, and he enjoyed the exotic, and he enjoyed the escape and all of that, and he was looking for stories, and he had this uncanny, almost prophetic vision of what was happening to the century unfolding in front of him. Nonetheless, I can't speak for the Catholicism, but certainly for the communism, it seems to me that he was profoundly anti-American and profoundly committed to the lot and the amelioration of ordinary life.
He wasn't a communist at all. Absolutely not. For 3 months when he was at Oxford. But he knew the dangers of totalitarianism, but he was very keen to point out the dangers of kind of authoritarianism in America, which people on the whole turned a blind eye to, whereas everybody knew about the totalitarianism in Russia, but he was never a communist. No, I mean, except as an undergraduate.
He does, however, the flirtation with the idea of risk continues very late on in life. This notion of embracing Kim Philby, perhaps the most celebrated traitor of his generation. Yeah. How do you account for that? And yet on one hand he's a patriotic Englishman.
The only thing he and I ever quarrelled about was Philby. He wrote a very interesting piece called The Virtues of Disloyalty, in which he says how necessary a heretic is to a church. And he said that Kim Philby believed in it, in what he believed in, and though it was the opposite of what he and I believed in, one should respect that belief. I didn't quite go for that, but he admired the kind of outside of a maverick. Can I just say about his religion that I once said to him, I remember it was 1955 in Stockholm, I said, why are you a Catholic? Because most of what you enjoy, you're not meant to do as a Catholic. And he said, when you were young, did you believe that the flames of hell were waiting beneath the floorboards to swallow you up? And I said, yes. And he said, and did you enjoy that feeling? No. And he said, and did you get out of that feeling quickly? And I said, yes. And he said, some people never get out of it. And then he said, I wouldn't recommend anyone to be a Catholic unless they had to be.
Finally, from all three of you, can I just have a statement on his stature? We have lost today a very great novelist, haven't we, Piers Paul Reed?
Yes, certainly. One of the finest novelists of his generation.
Oh, yes, I mean, at the very least, he'll be remembered as Robert Louis Stevenson is, but more because he wrote 4 times as many novels as Robert Louis Stevenson, and he got deeper into the human soul.
Robert McCrum. I think for me, he's somebody who spoke directly to us as English writers and readers, and particularly English readers, and that's a great achievement.
Thank you all very much indeed. That's all from The Late Show. Good night. And thank you.